Margaret White sat in front of the mirror, staring at the small bump that had appeared on her forehead. At first, she thought it was just a pimple, a common nuisance she'd dealt with countless times before. But this one was different. It was bigger, more painful, and had appeared out of nowhere. She gently prodded it with her finger, wincing at the sharp pain. "It's probably nothing," she muttered to herself, trying to ignore the growing discomfort. For the past few days, the bump had become increasingly tender. Margaret, now in her early 50s, had always prided herself on being healthy. She had no history of severe health problems, and with 2 grown children and a loving husband, she thought she had everything under control. But this pain, it was hard to ignore. It wasn't just the pain of the pimple, but a deep, unsettling ache that seemed to pulse beneath her skin. As the hours passed, the pain intensified and the bump grew larger. Margaret noticed a slight fever creeping in, her body temperature rising in a way that felt unusual. Her once regular morning routine now seemed impossible as dizziness began to cloud her vision. By noon, she found herself sitting on the edge of the bed, clutching her forehead, her breath shallow as her pulse quickened. She had never felt anything like this before. She called out to her husband, Arthur White, in the next room. "Arthur, I think something's wrong." Her voice trembled as she fought back the rising panic. Arthur rushed into the room, concern etching his features. He reached out, placing his hand on her forehead, his expression deepening. "Margaret, you're burning up. We need to get you to the hospital now." With her pulse racing and the pain worsening, Margaret hesitated for a moment, but she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was terribly wrong. The couple rushed to the emergency room, the minutes feeling like hours. The weight of the unknown pressed down on Margaret's chest as she tried to steady her breath. What had started as a simple pimple had turned into something far more sinister. The pain was no longer just physical, it was emotional, as the fear of not knowing what was happening to her body began to take over. As Margaret sat in the waiting room, her mind raced with terrifying possibilities. What if this was something serious? A tumor? An infection? The questions piled up, but she had no answers. The only thing she knew for sure was that she was in pain, and the doctors were her last hope. The tension in the air was palpable as the nurse called her name. Margaret, fighting back tears, stood up, clutching Arthur's hand as they walked towards the examination room. The door closed behind them, and they entered a world of uncertainty, where the truth was waiting to be uncovered. What would the doctors find? Margaret had always been an active woman, someone who rarely took sick days and lived a healthy, balanced lifestyle. She kept a routine that included regular walks, cooking wholesome meals, and tending to her garden. At 55, she was proud of the life she had built: 2 grown children, a husband of 30 years, and a quiet home in the suburbs. She had no serious medical history, nothing that would suggest she'd be in danger now. Yet this strange pimple on her forehead was different. It began as a small, barely noticeable bump a few days ago. Margaret didn't think much of it at first. Just a blemish, she thought, and went about her day. Over the years, she had dealt with the occasional pimple or skin irritation, which she attributed to stress, diet, or the occasional change in skincare products. But this time it didn't go away. It grew bigger, harder, and more painful as the days passed. At first, she tried to ignore it. It wasn't the first time her skin had reacted this way. But by the second day, Margaret noticed something wasn't right. The area around the bump began to swell, and she felt a slight throbbing. By the third day, she could feel a slight warmth radiating from her forehead. The once small pimple now felt like a painful lump under her skin. Margaret tried applying some over-the-counter creams she had used in the past. They didn't help. Instead, the swelling continued to worsen, and the pain became unbearable. She kept telling herself it was just a stubborn pimple, something she could easily manage. But as the days went on, the discomfort was too much to ignore. Her family, particularly her daughter Emma White, was the first to express concern. Emma, who worked as a nurse, had seen her mother's condition worsen and insisted she get it checked out. "Mom, you need to go to the doctor. This doesn't look normal," Emma had told her one evening as they sat together in the living room. Margaret waved it off, telling her daughter it was nothing serious. But deep down, Margaret knew Emma was right. Something was off. Reluctantly, Margaret made an appointment with her family doctor, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had been treating her for years. But when Dr. Mitchell examined the bump, even she was taken aback. The pimple didn't resemble anything Margaret had dealt with before. It didn't look like a typical cyst or pimple, and the surrounding area had become inflamed in a way that concerned her. "We might need to look into this further," Dr. Mitchell said, her voice tinged with caution. The visit to Dr. Mitchell would mark the beginning of a journey that Margaret had never expected. a journey that would change everything she thought she knew about her health. Little did she know, the tiny bump on her forehead would lead her down a path of medical mystery, one that would eventually lead to the emergency room. By the time the fourth day arrived, Margaret couldn't ignore the signs any longer. The bump on her forehead, which had once been a simple irritation, had now become a source of constant worry. Her once bright, active demeanor had shifted into a constant state of discomfort. The throbbing pain had become unbearable, and she could feel a strange pressure building under the skin. Every time she touched the pimple, it sent a sharp pain radiating across her forehead, and the surrounding skin felt unnaturally warm to the touch. As the swelling worsened, so did her fear. The pimple, now a hard lump, had begun to pulse with an intensity that made her shiver. Margaret tried to tell herself that it was nothing more than a stubborn cyst or an infected pimple, but deep down, something told her that this was different. It wasn't just the pain, it was the odd sensation that came with it, the feeling that there was something inside her skin growing, pressing against her. Emma, her daughter, noticed the change in her mother's behavior. Margaret had always been a trooper, strong, independent, and able to weather any storm. But now, her usually calm and composed demeanor was clouded by worry. Emma had seen her mother push through minor health issues before, but this was something else. "Mom, you're looking pale," Emma remarked one evening, sitting down beside her. "You're not feeling well at all. We need to do something about this." Margaret tried to brush it off, offering a weak smile, but Emma wasn't convinced. "This isn't just a pimple. We need to get you seen by someone who knows what they're doing." Her daughter was insistent, and despite her mother's protests, Emma took matters into her own hands. She picked up the phone and called Dr. Sarah Mitchell's office, urgently requesting an appointment. Margaret, though hesitant, finally agreed. As much as she hated being a burden, she knew deep down that she couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine. When they arrived at Dr. Mitchell's office, Margaret felt a sense of dread wash over her. She had always trusted Dr. Mitchell, but this time she couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. As Dr. Mitchell examined the pimple again, her brow furrowed. "This doesn't look like any common skin issue I've seen before," she said, her voice low. "We might be dealing with something more complex. I'm referring you to a specialist for further testing." The referral to a specialist was a clear sign that things were more serious than Margaret had wanted to admit. With every passing hour, her unease grew. Something was wrong and she didn't know what it was, but she was about to find out. The days following the referral to the specialist were a blur for Margaret. The initial sense of relief that came with the appointment soon gave way to dread. As she waited for the test results, her condition continued to worsen. The once manageable discomfort had now turned into a constant, throbbing pain that seemed to pulse beneath the surface of her skin. Every movement she made, every slight turn of her head, sent waves of agony through her forehead. She couldn't ignore it anymore. What was once a small, painful bump had now expanded into an angry, red, swollen mass. The area around it was tender to the touch, and the pain had spread from her forehead to the top of her scalp, almost as if the infection, or whatever it was beginning to spread. Margaret's face felt hot and heavy, as if her skin was stretched too tight over her skull. The fever, which had come and gone, returned with a vengeance. Her body felt weak and even the smallest task seemed impossible. She had always been the one to push through, to take care of everything and everyone. But now Margaret found herself helpless. She felt physically drained and mentally overwhelmed, not just by the pain but by the constant worry gnawing at her. What was happening to her? Why wasn't the swelling going down? Why did the pain feel so much worse? It wasn't just the physical discomfort that was affecting her. Every time she looked in the mirror, her appearance seemed foreign to her. The bump on her forehead was grotesque, and the fever made her pale, her eyes hollowed out from the sleepless nights. Arthur, her husband, was growing increasingly concerned. He had watched Margaret battle through so many things over the years, but he had never seen her like this. "Margaret," Arthur said one evening, his voice filled with quiet desperation. "This is more than just a pimple. We need to get you to the emergency room. You've been in pain for too long and I can't stand seeing you like this." Margaret hesitated, but deep down she knew he was right. She had been trying to convince herself it was nothing, but now she couldn't deny the seriousness of the situation. The once small irritation had turned into something far bigger, and her body was telling her that it was time to take action. With a heavy heart and the support of Arthur, she finally agreed. They went to the emergency room, where the tension in the air seemed almost suffocating. Margaret could feel her pulse quicken as they waited for the doctor. The pain was almost unbearable now, and the feeling of dread only grew stronger. What would they find? What had started as something so trivial now seemed like a life-altering event. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as the car raced toward the hospital. The sharp pain in her forehead had become almost unbearable, and her head swam with dizziness. She tried to take deep breaths, but every inhale felt shallow and strained. Arthur, her husband, kept glancing at her, his face pale with concern. The hospital's emergency room lights flickered ahead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the scene. It felt as though everything was moving in slow motion, but Margaret could hear the rapid beating of her own heart, matching the rhythm of the pain in her head. When they arrived, the waiting room was packed with people, all sitting in silence or murmuring among themselves. The noise, the chaos, the sterile smell of antiseptic, it all made her head spin. She stumbled slightly as she walked up to the reception desk, clutching her forehead, her face contorted in pain. The receptionist quickly took notice of her condition. "Ma'am, are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Margaret nodded weakly, managing a small smile, but the pain didn't let up. Arthur leaned in, his voice shaking. "She needs to be seen immediately. The pain is getting worse." Within minutes, a nurse ushered them into a small examination room. The nurse, Nurse Linda, was kind but efficient, checking Margaret's vitals before leaving to fetch Dr. James Anderson, the ear doctor. Margaret sat down, feeling the cold of the room seep into her bones. Arthur rubbed her shoulder gently, trying to calm her, but Margaret's anxiety was growing. What if this was something serious? What if the pain in her head meant something far worse than a simple infection? Dr. Anderson entered the room with a clipboard in hand, his expression professional but focused. He introduced himself with a reassuring smile. "Mrs. White, I understand you're in pain. Let's get you checked out properly. We'll take care of this." Margaret managed a weak nod, feeling her heart race faster at his words. Dr. Anderson began by examining her forehead. The swelling had increased since they left home, and he noted the red streaks radiating from the bump. He pressed gently on the area and Margaret winced. The pain was sharp, like something was pressing against her skull. Dr. Anderson's brow furrowed as he carefully examined the bump, looking closely for any signs of infection or other abnormalities. "This doesn't look like any regular pimple or cyst," Dr. Anderson said quietly, his voice serious. "We'll need to run some tests to understand what's going on. I'm referring you for an immediate CT scan to get a clearer picture." Margaret's stomach sank. She had no idea what was happening to her, but now she feared the worst. A tumor? An abscess? The uncertainty made her chest tighten, and she couldn't stop the tears that began to well up in her eyes. Arthur held her hand tightly, his own fear evident in his grip. "We'll get through this," he whispered, though the doubt in his voice betrayed his own worries. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to steady herself as the weight of the unknown pressed down on her. Margaret sat in the sterile room, the seconds ticking by as she awaited the results of her CT scan. The dread that had been gnawing at her for days now felt like a tangible weight pressing on her chest. The scan had been quick, but the fear of what it might reveal lingered. She had always considered herself healthy, someone who took care of herself, never expecting to face something this frightening. Arthur, who had been pacing the room nervously, now sat beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. He didn't speak, but the silence between them was heavy with unspoken fear. The nurse had taken her blood pressure and temperature earlier, but all Margaret could focus on was the painful throb in her forehead. It was still there, constant and unyielding, making her feel as though her whole world was spinning out of control. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Anderson entered the room, his face tight with concern. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mrs. White, we've received the results of your CT scan," he began, his voice measured. "We found something unusual. It's not a typical infection, and it doesn't appear to be a simple cyst. There seems to be some sort of growth beneath the surface of your skin. We're concerned that it might be something more serious." Margaret's heart dropped at his words. "More serious?" she whispered, her throat tightening. "What do you mean?" Dr. Anderson paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "We can't be sure without further testing, but based on what we're seeing, it could be an abscess or even a tumor. It's too early to make a definitive diagnosis, but we need to run more tests immediately to figure out what's going on." Arthur squeezed her hand, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tumor?" he echoed, as though hearing the word out loud made it even more real. Dr. Anderson nodded grimly. "We need to act quickly. I'm referring you to a specialist who can perform a biopsy to determine exactly what this growth is. It might be nothing, but we have to be thorough. I'm scheduling you for the biopsy tomorrow." Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. The word biopsy echoed in her mind, sending a chill down her spine. She'd heard of biopsies before, but she never thought she'd be the one facing one. She was terrified, but she didn't know what else to do except trust the doctors. Dr. Anderson reassured her, though his tone was tinged with a caution that Margaret didn't miss. "We're doing everything we can, Margaret. It's important to stay calm and take things one step at a time. We'll get you through this." As the doctor left the room, Arthur turned to Margaret, his face a mixture of fear and determination. "We'll get through this," he repeated, but this time it was for both of them. Margaret didn't know what the future held, but the fear of the unknown was almost as painful as the bump on her forehead. The test would be crucial. The waiting, however, felt endless. The day of the biopsy arrived, and with it came a fresh wave of anxiety. Margaret could barely eat breakfast, the thought of what might be lurking beneath her skin too overwhelming to focus on anything else. Arthur drove her to the hospital, his face set in a tight expression, betraying the worry he tried to hide. They'd been through so much over the past few days, tests, scans, and now this. But nothing could have prepared them for what was about to unfold. Inside the sterile white room where the biopsy would take place, Margaret lay back on the examination table, her palms sweaty and her heart racing. The bright lights above only served to intensify the feeling that she was stepping into the unknown. A nurse, Nurse Julia, prepped her, speaking in calming tones as she inserted a needle into Margaret's skin to numb the area. Despite the numbing injection, the pain still pulsed deep inside her, and every second felt like an eternity. Dr. Thomas Anderson, the specialist, entered the room shortly after. His presence, usually reassuring, now seemed to carry a certain weight. He greeted them with his usual calm demeanor, but Margaret could sense the tension in his eyes. "We'll take good care of you, Margaret," he said softly, though the words did little to soothe her growing unease. As Dr. Anderson performed the biopsy, Margaret tried to keep her mind occupied, but it was impossible. The sensation of the needle piercing her skin, the soft sounds of the procedure, all felt so invasive. Then, after what seemed like an agonizingly long time, Dr. Anderson pulled the needle out and immediately began examining the sample under a microscope. The air in the room grew thick with anticipation. Margaret's stomach churned as she waited for the results, her mind racing with the worst-case scenarios. Arthur held her hand tightly, offering what little comfort he could, though even he was struggling to maintain his composure. "It's almost over," he whispered, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed his own fear. It wasn't long before Dr. Anderson stood up, his face suddenly serious. He motioned for the nurse to leave the room, and a heavy silence settled between them. Margaret's heart dropped. She had learned enough by now to know that this wasn't good news. "I need to be honest with you," Dr. Anderson began, his voice low. "The sample we just took, it's not what we expected. There's a growth inside your forehead, but it's not a benign cyst as we had hoped. It's a foreign object, something embedded deep within your skin, and it's likely been there for quite some time." Margaret blinked, struggling to process his words. "A foreign object?" she repeated, confusion and fear battling inside her. "What do you mean?" Dr. Anderson paused, clearly weighing his next words carefully. "It appears that what we're dealing with is not a typical skin issue at all. The object inside your forehead is something that's never been seen in medical literature before. We suspect it's a rare form of cyst or growth caused by an infection, but we can't say for sure without further testing. We'll need to conduct additional imaging and possibly surgery to remove it." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Margaret's mind whirled. She had thought the worst was over once the pimple had been examined. Now she was faced with something even more unsettling, an unexplained foreign object embedded deep within her body. Arthur's grip on her hand tightened, and Margaret, despite the numbness she felt, turned to him. She needed him more than ever now. The weight of the unknown was heavy, but they had come this far together. "We'll handle this," Arthur said softly, though his own voice wavered. Margaret could only nod, a tear slipping down her cheek. She didn't know what came next, but the journey ahead was far from over. And the truth of what was inside her forehead had only just begun to reveal itself. The next few hours passed in a blur for Margaret. The unsettling news that there was a foreign object inside her forehead, something that shouldn't have been there, left her mind in a haze. Her body felt numb, as though she was detached from her own emotions. It was as if her life had been frozen in time, and she was merely a spectator, watching as the world around her moved forward without her. Arthur sat by her side, his face etched with concern. He hadn't let go of her hand since Dr. Anderson's diagnosis. Margaret could see the worry in his eyes, but she couldn't bring herself to comfort him. She was consumed by her own fear and uncertainty. What did this mean? What had caused the object to grow in her skin? And most importantly, was she going to be okay? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft knock on the door. It was Emma, her daughter, who had arrived after work. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from worry. "Mom," she said softly, walking over to Margaret and giving her a gentle hug. "I'm here, we're all here for you." Margaret felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had always been the strong one in the family, the one who took care of everything, the one who kept things together. But now it felt as though she was falling apart. "Emma, I don't know what's happening," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "They don't know what it is. It could be anything and I'm scared." Emma squeezed her mother's hand. "Mom, I know you're scared. But you're not alone in this. Dad and I are here and we're going to get through this together. We'll fight whatever this is as a family." Her words were meant to soothe, but the reality of the situation still hung heavily in the air. Margaret could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. She had never felt so vulnerable, so out of control. As she looked at Arthur and Emma, their faces full of worry, she felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. They were all suffering because of her. Her family was carrying the emotional burden of her illness, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was the cause of their pain. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to block out the rising tide of emotion. The fear, the anxiety, the uncertainty, it all swirled within her. She wished she could take it all away for them. She wished she could be the strong, calm mother and wife they needed. But right now she was afraid. She didn't know what was coming next. Arthur leaned in, brushing a tear from Margaret's cheek. "We'll figure this out, Maggie. One step at a time. We don't have all the answers yet, but we will." His words were a balm, though the underlying tension in his voice was hard to ignore. Margaret wanted to believe him, but in her heart, she wasn't sure. Could they really face this together? And what would the future hold for her, and for all of them? As Emma sat by her side, Margaret reached out and took her daughter's hand. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of connection, a small glimmer of hope in the midst of all the uncertainty. They would fight this together. And no matter what the future held, they would face it as a family. After the diagnosis, Margaret felt like she was trapped in a whirlwind of emotions. The initial shock of learning that there was something foreign inside her forehead was still fresh in her mind, but now there was something else to focus on. What came next? Dr. Anderson had been clear. They needed to act quickly. The biopsy had confirmed the presence of a foreign object, but now they had to decide on the best course of treatment to remove it. Margaret felt a deep sense of helplessness as she listened to the medical team explain her options. "Margaret," Dr. Anderson began, his voice steady yet kind, "we've done all the tests and now we have a clearer understanding of what we're dealing with. The growth inside your forehead isn't just an infection. It's a foreign body that's become embedded in the tissue. The good news is that it hasn't spread to other areas, but we do need to remove it surgically as soon as possible." Margaret nodded, trying to absorb everything Dr. Anderson was saying. "Surgery?" The word echoed in her mind, but she didn't have the energy to respond. Arthur, ever the steady presence by her side, squeezed her hand and asked the question that had been plaguing them both. "What are the risks? Is this something we should be worried about?" Dr. Anderson gave a reassuring smile. "The surgery will be straightforward. We'll remove the growth and examine it more closely to ensure there's no further cause for concern. The risk is minimal, but we will take every precaution to make sure everything goes smoothly." Despite Dr. Anderson's reassurance, the thought of surgery terrified Margaret. She had never been a fan of hospitals or medical procedures. It wasn't that she was afraid of the pain, it was the fear of the unknown that gripped her. What if something went wrong? What if the surgery uncovered something even worse than they had anticipated? Arthur, sensing her anxiety, leaned in and spoke softly. "Margaret, I know this is scary, but we have to trust the doctors. They know what they're doing. We've come this far and we're going to get through this together." Margaret closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She knew Arthur was right. But still, the fear gnawed at her. This wasn't something she could control, and that terrified her. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced before. The strong, independent woman she had always been now seemed small in the face of the uncertainty surrounding her. As the discussion about the surgery continued, Dr. Anderson and his team carefully explained the next steps. They would schedule the operation for the following week, giving Margaret time to mentally prepare. In the meantime, she was prescribed painkillers to help manage the discomfort, and she was given strict instructions to rest and avoid any strenuous activities. Despite the fear and uncertainty, there was a sense of relief that came with having a plan. At least now Margaret knew what to expect. She wasn't entirely at peace, but the steps toward recovery were clear. Arthur kissed her forehead gently, a quiet promise passing between them. "We'll get through this," he whispered as Margaret closed her eyes and tried to hold on to that small thread of hope. The day of the surgery arrived faster than Margaret had anticipated. Her emotions were a mix of dread and reluctant acceptance. She had spent the past few days preparing herself mentally, though she knew that no amount of preparation could fully ease the fear that gripped her. The uncertainty of the procedure, the possibility of complications, and the fear of what might be uncovered during the surgery all weighed heavily on her mind. When she arrived at the hospital, the familiar sterile smells of antiseptic filled the air, and the quiet hum of machines added to the tension in her chest. Arthur was by her side as always, his hand firmly holding hers. "You've got this, Margaret," he whispered, his voice steady despite the worry etched on his face. Margaret smiled weakly, grateful for his presence, but deep down she wasn't sure if she truly believed in his words. The fear of the unknown had a way of clouding everything. Dr. Anderson, along with his team, greeted Margaret in the preoperative room. His calm, reassuring presence was exactly what she needed. "We're going to take excellent care of you today," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "This will be a routine procedure and we'll make sure everything goes smoothly." Despite his assurances, Margaret couldn't shake the tightness in her chest. The nurse, Nurse Linda, began preparing her for the surgery, administering in foreline while offering soft words of comfort. As the anesthesiologist introduced himself, explaining what would happen during the anesthesia process, Margaret felt her anxiety rise again. The thought of being unconscious, of not being in control, left her feeling exposed, vulnerable. Soon, the surgical team wheeled her into the operating room, a cold, bright space where the sterile scent of disinfectant hung in the air. Margaret tried to focus on the sounds around her, the beeping of monitors, the soft shuffle of the medical staff, but everything felt distant as though she were underwater. Her heart raced, and for a moment she wished she could just wake up and find all of this a bad dream. Dr. Anderson's voice cut through her haze. "We're going to put you under now. You'll be asleep for the entire procedure." Margaret nodded, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The anesthesiologist gently placed a mask over her nose and mouth, instructing her to take a deep breath. As the cool, calming air filled her lungs, she felt herself drifting, the world around her fading away. The surgery itself was intricate, but the medical team was well prepared. The foreign object inside Margaret's forehead had been deeply embedded in the tissue, making it difficult to remove. Dr. Anderson worked carefully, ensuring that no damage was done to the surrounding areas. The procedure lasted longer than expected, but the medical team remained calm and focused. In the recovery room, Margaret slowly began to regain consciousness. The first thing she felt was the dull ache in her forehead, a reminder of the procedure. As her vision cleared, she saw Arthur sitting beside her, his face full of relief. "You're awake," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "The surgery went well. They've removed it." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. The pain was still there, but the fear had lessened. The growth had been removed, and the doctors were confident it hadn't spread. But as the grogginess of anesthesia wore off, one question lingered in her mind. What had that object been? The answer to that question would come later, but for now, Margaret was just grateful that she had made it through the surgery. The road to recovery had begun, and with Arthur by her side, she felt a glimmer of hope. The days following the surgery were both a relief and a challenge for Margaret. The physical pain was manageable with medication, but the emotional toll of everything she had been through began to weigh on her. The fear that had gripped her during the biopsy and the surgery was slowly lifting, but in its place, a sense of exhaustion and vulnerability remained. She had never imagined that a simple bump on her forehead could lead to such a roller coaster of emotions. Arthur remained her pillar of support. He stayed by her side throughout her recovery, helping her with the small tasks she could no longer do herself. Margaret felt a deep sense of gratitude for him. He had always been there for her, but this ordeal had brought them even closer. The bond they shared was stronger than ever. As the days passed, Margaret's condition steadily improved. The swelling in her forehead began to subside, and the bruising from the surgery started to fade. She was able to return home, though her movements were still slow and careful. The recovery process was a lot more than just physical healing. It was about regaining her strength, both mentally and emotionally. There were moments of quiet reflection, where Margaret found herself wondering how something so small had caused such chaos in her life. Her family visited her regularly, each visit bringing comfort and strength. Emma, who had been so worried, would sit beside her mother, holding her hand, just like when Margaret had held her hand as a child. Margaret's grandchildren visited too, their bright smiles and innocent questions about why she had bandages on her forehead filling the room with warmth. Even in the midst of her own recovery, Margaret found herself focusing on them, feeling a sense of joy in their laughter. After a week of rest, Dr. Anderson called with the results from the object that had been removed. The object, a strange, hardened mass that had been embedded in her skin, turned out to be an old, calcified cyst that had been slowly growing for years without her noticing. It wasn't cancerous and there was no sign of infection. The mystery was solved and Margaret breathed a sigh of relief. She had feared the worst, but the reality was something much less sinister. "You're going to make a full recovery, Margaret," Dr. Anderson assured her when they met in his office for a follow-up. "There are no signs of any further complications and the surgery was a success. Your body will take a little time to heal fully, but you're on the right path." Margaret smiled, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting off her shoulders. She could hardly believe it was over. The shock of the whole experience still lingered, but now she could look forward to getting back to her life. As she walked out of Dr. Anderson's office, hand in hand with Arthur, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in weeks. It had been a long, difficult journey, but she had made it through. She knew she wasn't the same woman who had walked into the hospital days ago. She was stronger, more grateful for the life she had, and more aware of the importance of family. The ordeal had been terrifying, but it had also reminded her of the incredible support system she had around her. As they left the hospital, the world seemed a little brighter. Margaret knew that she had come out of this not just physically healed, but emotionally restored, with a deeper appreciation for the love and care of those who had stood by her throughout the ordeal. The road ahead wasn't without its challenges, but for the first time in weeks, Margaret felt ready to face whatever came next.